Okay.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's time to begin. I'm going to begin, as usual, by just recapping. It was 2 weeks ago since we last met. So I'm just going to remind you, first of all, and elaborate a little bit on what I said at the end of last week. So remember, what I'm trying to do this term, what I'm trying to approach is the notion of an unconscious thought, sorry, the notion of conscious thought, the notion of conscious thought episode. I'm contrasting that with an unconscious belief. And at the moment I'm just talking about thoughts and beliefs. I will go on to talk about perception and other conscious states later, and also other unconscious states. But I'm trying to start by getting the contrast between the unconscious belief and conscious thought. At the end of last week, I talked about the idea of belief being unconscious, and that the notion of a propositional attitude is something that shouldn't be taken for granted. I said that the notion of a propositional attitude was a sort of heavily theoretical notion invented by Russell, and was designed to features of the mental states that Russell and his contemporaries were interested in the early 20th century, particularly the notion of truth and falsehood, and the notion of judgment. So I said that the best way to understand propositional attitudes is not to think of them as genuinely being, in some sense, in their nature, relations to propositions, as people talk as if they are, as if that was a thing, being a relation to a proposition. I want to say, in a way it's a thing, but in a way it isn't. It's not a fundamental thing. It's something that needs to be understood. Now, the image that I have for understanding it, or the comparison I have, is with the idea of a model, a scientific model. What happens in science, to simplify enormously, is that often understanding is facilitated by taking something which is simpler than the thing you're trying to understand and looking at the features of that simpler thing. So the example I had last week or 2 weeks ago was Rutherford's famous model of the electron as a solar system. So you have the nucleus in the middle, and then you have the electrons orbiting the nucleus. Now the idea isn't that that's what the atom would look like. The atom wouldn't look like that if, which of course is impossible, you were able to see it. It's just that's a way of understanding the behavior of the atom by comparing it to something that we already know. So a model is a very loose and fluid and therefore fertile concept. Mathematical models are, in this sense, models. They're idealizations. Actually, models, actual wooden, metal, plastic models are also models. So there's not, when people use the model of the double helix structure of DNA, if you go to one of these museums, you'll see that there are these little, round balls of different colors on this sort of spiral thing. That's a model of DNA. So what I'm saying here is not that when people talked about propositional attitudes, when people first started talking about belief and judgment, that they were drawing their inspiration from science. I'm not saying that. I'm not making that claim. I'm saying that there's a general tendency in human thinking, in theoretical thinking, which is to compare something complex to something simple, and to try and understand it by the complex thing by comparing it to the simple thing. In part, this is idealization, in part, it's simplification. So I said that's the way we should think of a proposition. And I compared it to, I don't claim any great originality for this. I think I'm just spelling out something which I think David Lewis invented, which is the comparison between using propositions to measure people's mental states and using numbers to measure physical magnitudes. So that was the point of the analogy of the bag of sugar. So I will come back to that that point shortly. But that's I talked about unconscious beliefs. I've talked about that quite a lot in the last few weeks. I introduced the idea of a model 2 weeks ago. I'll come back to it. But then I said, well, if you're taking the model to be, as Michael Weisberg says, an indirect theoretical representation of some part of reality, what is the part of reality we're talking about? And this is where I said, the picture I want to reject is the idea that there are an enormous number of belief states in your brain or in your mind or in your soul. There aren't these individual belief states in the same sense. What there is are the ascriptions of individual beliefs by ascribers, and then there's the psychological reality that they're modeling. And that psychological reality is unconscious, and that's why I christened the subject's worldview. Maybe worldview isn't a great term, because view sounds like it should be something conscious. And view is going to be different from point of view. So I'm using the word worldview at the moment, but really it's your total psychological orientation to reality. That's what it is, your unconscious orientation to reality. Now I'm just taking that as a thing, as an entity. If you're a physicalist, I don't know, if you're a physicalist, I don't know what you're doing here. Oh, Henry. He has to be here. He's my postdoc. So, but if you're a physicalist, you can think of the worldview as being embodied in the brain somehow. Of course, you have no idea how that's embodied in the brain, and neither do I. So we're on equal footing, but it is embodied somewhere in you, your worldview, which is your total psychological orientation towards the world, your unconscious orientation. Now, so I'm going to say something, I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, because I haven't said too much about it yet. I won't go on about unconscious belief again. Well, I may do actually. And then I'm going to say something about the idea of phenomenal and access consciousness, because anyone who's read a bit of the philosophy or psychology literature in recent years, you may know that about this distinction introduced by Ned Block in the 1990s, which has taken on a life of its own, and people think it's an important distinction in the field of consciousness. I think it's an important distinction too. I'm going to say I've had a slightly different spin on it from the way that Ned Block does. So I'm going to say a little bit about that. And then I'm going to try and approach again my main topic, which is the reality of conscious content. There was I taught for many years at UCL, University College London, and one of the professors there was a man called Richard Vogel, a great philosopher of art, and philosopher of mind, philosopher of psychoanalysis. He used to give a series of lectures every year called Immortality, which was an introduction to philosophy. And he'd say, at the beginning of the year, he'd say, I'm going to talk about immortality. I'm going to explain to you what the question is about immortality, and I'm going to tell you about why you are or are not immortal. But before I have to do that, I'm going to have to talk about the person. Because obviously you are all persons, so I have to tell you something about persons. And he went on to talk about persons. Oh, now I have to tell you something about mind and matter, because I have to tell you about the person and mind and matter. Now I have to tell you about persisting cells and persisting substances before I can get to the question of immortality. And he never actually got to the question of immortality. So this is, but I am going to get there eventually to the reality of conscious thinking or conscious content, as I'm going to call it. So this is what I said about unconscious beliefs last week. I'm just repeating myself now. Beliefs in many intentional states are unconscious, I said. That's the propositional content of a belief is a model in the philosophy of science sense, not in the sense of model theory and logic. If anyone knows about that. And I say what is being modeled is the subject's unconscious worldview. That's what I just said. So this is your start of the 10th. Who's this? This is Wittgenstein. Now I'm going to say just one thing about unconscious belief. Actually, Wittgenstein agrees with me. He says believing is not thinking. And then he says, and this is just up at this here for Craig, he likes parenthetical remarks of Wittgenstein, believing is not thinking. A grammatical remark. Now, whatever Wittgenstein meant by grammar, he can't have meant grammar. There's nothing ungrammatical about saying believing is thinking, or it's not the case that believing is not thinking. If something was, so he also said, for example, one plays patience by oneself, patience the game. One plays patience by oneself. So this is a grammatical remark. Well, he can't have meant that it was a grammatical remark because it's not ungrammatical to say one does not play patience by oneself. So whatever he meant, and I'll tell you what he meant by grammar, he meant what we mean today by conceptual truth. It's a conceptual truth. It's just he didn't want to dress it up by saying it was conceptual truth. He wanted to say it was something rather commonplace like grammar. Clearly, grammar does not explain why believing is not thinking. And so although Wittgenstein is right in saying this grammatical remark on his view is saying it lacks an explanation. There's nothing more you can say about it. It's just a grammatical remark, a grammatical fact, a basic fact, I don't know, conceptual truth or something like that. We can do better than that, and we did, and with the help of Kent Barker, when I had this nice quote from Kent Barker. And by the way, the slides for these seminars will be on our website very shortly. There's been a bit of a delay on that. I apologize for that. But, so all these references you'll be able to pick up. But this is from a nice paper by Kent Barker called Analysis of Self-Deception, where Barker said, and I mentioned this last week, I deny that a current believing is believing at all, or in my terminology, that thinking that P is either necessary or sufficient for believing in P. And here's one of his reasons, and this is the reason I like. Unlike thoughts, beliefs are states, not occurrences. So remember, I'm resting a lot on this distinction between states and occurrences. Anyway, so that's Kent Barker pushes things a bit further than Wittgenstein here. This is what I said about the worldview then. The belief ascription models aspects of the subject's worldview. Now, the subject's worldview is not something that's made up of beliefs in the sense that I'm rejecting. The subject's worldview is not your belief set. If you take the idea of a belief set literally, then it's something with, on the normal understanding of set, something with a determinate number of members, and those would be your beliefs. And I'm trying to reject that whole picture. The unconscious worldview is something which is supposed to accommodate the confusion and contradiction and the unarticulated nature of a lot of our psychological orientation. So I'm proposing this as a more realistic way of thinking of psychological reality than the picture that you get. I say standard, I don't know if it's a standard picture, but a picture that used to be very popular in philosophy and the philosophy of psychology, which is Jerry Vogel's idea of a language of thought. Thought must have a language. Of course, by saying that, I don't reject some of the reasons that Vogel gave for saying that thought had language. Some of those reasons were, for example, that there is unconscious psychological processing, and that some of the unconscious psychological processing has a causal structure that must in some way mirror its psychological structure. I'm not going to talk about that. That's a hypothesis that Vogel had. I don't think we have enough reason to believe in that hypothesis. Why I start with this idea of the worldview, although it's helpfully vague, I want to try and do two things. I want to say that there is a psychological reality. There is an unconscious psychological reality. It's what governs your behavior. So if you know about functionalism in the philosophy of mind, you can just think of this as a functionalist story, that there are all these dispositions to behave that you have. They're organized in a certain way. I'll come back to that later. We know enough to know that they're organized, the unconscious psychological reality is organized in terms of mental, what I'm calling mental capacities. And we model this by using propositions. We model bits of it by using propositions. And the models idealize and they simplify, like all models. So I recently returned to some of the writings of Daniel Dennett on this subject, and there's a wonderful paper of his called Brain, Writing, and Mind Reading, which I recommend to you. It should be on the internet somewhere. It's in his book. It's published in his book called Brainstorms, which is a great early collection of papers by Dennett. He has this really nice example, rather sort of poignant example of Sam, the art critic. Sam is a reputable art critic who extols, buys, and promotes mediocre paintings by his son. He says, two different hypotheses are advanced. A, Sam does not believe the paintings are any good, but out of loyalty and love, he does this to help his son. Or B, Sam's love for his son has blinded him to the faults of the paintings, and he actually believes that they're good. So there are two hypotheses. Then it considers, in this essay, he considers the views of those people who think that beliefs are explicitly represented in the brain, and that the beliefs must be encoded in the brain. And he imagines that there's someone who he calls a neurocryptographer who can understand the code of your brain writing. And he goes into various details about how the neurocryptographer might actually figure out what it is that Sam really thinks here. Now he considers various things, but here's just one of the things. I'm sorry. Here's just one of the things he considers. He says, if our neurocryptographer were able to determine that Sam's last judgment on his deathbed was, "My consolation is that I fathered a great artist," we could still hold that the issue between the warring hypotheses was undecided. The two hypotheses, that either he thought his son was great or that he didn't, that he was deceiving himself. He said, we still hold that the issue between the warring hypotheses was decided, where this judgment may have been a self-deception. That's true. So maybe in his brain somewhere, he's uttered the sentence, or in the brain there is writing that means, "My consolation is that I fathered a great artist." How do we know whether that's what he believes? Because he could just be, so to speak, saying it to himself. Because if you can say things in your brain, if you can say things to yourself, and if there's brain writing, then you can write things in your brain to yourself and deceive yourself. He says, if discovering a man's judgment still leaves the matter of belief ascription undecided, are we so sure that Sam determinately had one belief or the other? Are we sure that there is a difference between his really and truly believing that his son is a good artist and his deceiving himself out of love while knowing the truth in his heart of hearts? I said it's a sort of poignant story, Sam the artist. Now that's a sort of skeptical challenge, because then it's not saying there are no facts of the matter. He's not saying in this paper there are no facts of the matter about what people believe. Particularly in straightforward cases, there may be perfectly clear facts about what people believe. It's just that if you think there's such a thing as the determinate belief or not belief, in this kind of case, then you ought to think there's got to be some answer to this, of which one Sam really believes. But it may be that there's no answer. Maybe that his psychology is so convoluted and confused at that level, at this complex level, because of the interweaving of his emotions about his son and his own professional competence and his own sense of his own standing. Maybe there's just no fact of the matter about which one of these things he really believes. Now, there's a kind of realist view of the mental that says there must be a fact of the matter, otherwise you don't believe in the mental. And this was the debate in the 1980s between Vogel and Dennett and others. Vogel on the one hand, and Dennett on the other. What I want to say is the reality of the mental, at least where the unconscious is concerned, is the unconscious worldview, and that is a psychological reality. I'll say what I mean by that in a minute. That is a psychological reality, but it need not have the structure of the language of thought, or something like that. You need not divide up into individual representations of individual beliefs. It can be much more indeterminate. Now, I think a good aspect of this is that we don't have to introduce an arbitrary distinction between those, which is quite common among some cognitive scientists or philosophers of cognitive science, between those beliefs or intentional states which are easily accessible to consciousness and those beliefs which you need to pay a psychotherapist to unravel. We need not buy into any particular architecture for the unconscious or the deep unconscious, or have a distinction between the sort of rational unconscious and the irrational unconscious. That's got to be left open by the initial picture. So there's no reason to think, as Jacques Lacan said, that the unconscious is structured like a language. I don't think the unconscious is structured like language. He didn't mean it in the same sense that Vogel meant it. Let me make a brief contrast with a couple of other views here, just to, perhaps, if you're familiar with some of the other views. I wonder if this works. Two other kinds of view. One is that only consciousness is mental. The only real mental reality is conscious reality. This is a view that was defended by Galen Strawson in the 90s, and John Searle. John Searle said in his book, The Rediscovery of the Mind, he said that there's no reason to think that there is any intentionality once you get away from the conscious. So he said there's no away from consciousness. So the only way in which something can count as intentional if it's going to figure in consciousness in some way. That's what he argued. Because he said there was no way of differentiating which the many possible things, interpretations that you can have of what was going on in your brain really counted as intentional. There's no such thing as what he called, which is a phrase that I liked, aspectual shape, by which he means the aspects under which things are represented in the emotional state. So the way in which the same object could be represented in different ways, he said there can't be any such thing in the brain. So for Searle, there's just the brain, and then there's consciousness. Galen Strawson thinks something similar to that. Riegert, in this interesting paper from a few years ago, argues that because of the extended mind hypothesis, and if you don't know what the extended mind hypothesis is, it doesn't matter for the time being. Because of the extended mind hypothesis, Goethe says we have no way of actually pinning down what is genuinely mental reality other than what's in consciousness. And it's a sort of skeptical challenge to the idea that there is such thing as unconscious mentality. I don't accept any of that. So I think there's conscious mentality and there's unconscious mentality. It's just that I reject the picture that what's going on in the case of an unconscious mental state, what's going on in the case of the unconscious mental state's representation of the world, it's basically the same kind of thing as the conscious mental state. So the picture that I'm rejecting is the idea that intentional states can have content in the same sense, whether they are conscious or unconscious. So that the propositional content idea, that's all there is to something having content. By content I mean representation of the world. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I do think there is unconscious intentionality. I think it's just unconscious intentionality has a different kind of structure from conscious intentionality. So I think there is a psychological organization of the unconscious. It's organized into things like, there's some motivational capacity that we have. There's some truth-tracking capacity, which we philosophers call belief, but other people might call something else. Maybe it's called reasoning, maybe it's called judgment or something like that, but there's something there which is trying to track how things are in the world. There are emotional capacities. There's perception, a lot of which is unconscious. And there's a lot of unconscious mental processing, which can only be understood psychologically. That's my hypothesis. So I reject those views. Another view, which is a more recent view, and this is slightly more kind of recherche, maybe, a bit more recherche, or a bit more fancy, which is the question of what propositions actually are, or what propositional content actually is. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but if you come across these views, I know some people in the front row here are familiar with these views, there's a very interesting book by a man called Peter Hanks called Propositional Content, where what he I think, he wants to say that the notion of a proposition, the notion of the content of a sentence, the truth-bearing content of a sentence, is not something that should be taken as basic, but it has to be explained. You have to give an account of what a proposition is. And his account of the proposition is basically in mentalistic terms. He wants to say propositions are types of judgments, and they're understood in terms of making judgments. So rather than, I mean, it's ironic really that the beginning of analytic philosophy, as I've been saying to you for a few weeks, this is one of the things I say a lot, and I repeat myself, I admit that. You know? But my experience is it's good to repeat yourself because sometimes not all of you are listening all the time. That could happen. I know sometimes I don't listen all the time to every lecture I hear, so it's good to repeat yourself, to come back. So one of the things point I made about early analytic philosophy was the centrality of the idea of judgment. That was what Russell was interested in, the idea of judgment. And the judgment could be absolutely true and absolutely false. Or absolutely. And this was part of the departure from the idealist philosophers, the Hegelians like Taggart and Bradley, Taggart and Kelly Bradley in Oxford, Green in Oxford. These were the British Hegelians who dominated British philosophy in the late 19th century. And Russell rejected their view by saying that judgment could be absolutely true or it could be absolutely false. And things weren't true or false to a magic degree. So the interesting thing is then he explained judgment in terms of relations to propositions. Now we come full circle, and Hanks and others, including Soames in a slightly different way, explain propositions in terms of judgment. So this is what I would call, Hanks's view, I would call a psychologistic version of the proposition, explaining the proposition not in purely logical terms, but in terms of psychological acts. However, in one way, I don't think this goes far enough. In one way, this goes too far. In another way, it doesn't go far enough. So it goes too far in the sense that there's no need to say that a proposition is reduced to acts of judgment. You get yourself into all sorts of problems if you say that. You just accept that there are propositions. You maybe want some story about how we come to talk about propositions and how we introduce them into our conception of mind. And then we don't have to reduce them, they can just be there as theoretical entities, invented theoretical entities. Another way it doesn't go far enough, I say, because I think in the end what we want to understand is not propositional content, but intentionality. And intentionality, the mind's direction on its objects, is not restricted to the proposition. So some of our most important mental attitudes, intentional attitudes, are not directed on propositions at all. Our emotional attitudes, our attachment to others, love and hate, dislike, affection, these things are intentional attitudes that are related to objects, things in the world, and not propositions. So many basic psychological states, like fear, for example, I think perception, I think desire, I think these things are not fundamentally relations to propositions. So I think we need, if we want to understand content in general, we want to understand more than just the proposition. Those remarks were for people who knew what this stuff is about. If you haven't got that far yet, it doesn't matter, you can forget what I've just said. All I'm saying is there are some people who think a bit similar, but a bit different. But my view's better. That's the general sort of line. Okay, any questions about what I just said? Yeah, right.
Maybe this is jumping the gun, but so you said there's a distinction between a structural distinction between conscious and unconscious content.
Yeah.
What could you give an example of?
Yeah. So the unconscious content, the reality of the unconscious content is what you're modeling with the proposition, say, in the case of belief. So there is unconscious representation of the world of a very complex sort. Its nature, what its nature is, is a large empirical question, but that's what there is. The modeling that goes on is it's just supposed to pick up aspects of that unconscious representation. And it may do that more or less well. So that's why I accepted, I think 2 weeks ago, you weren't here there, but so it's your fault. That I accepted the Chalmers, I view that Chalmers calls content pluralism, where you think of a mental state as associated with many different representational contents. And I think that's true, that's correct. In the case of the conscious thinking has a kind of determinacy and richness that the unconscious lacks. And it can be modeled as well, but it has something else, which is the manifest content of perception or conscious thinking. That's a very different kind of thing. Yeah.
I guess I was thinking, so if you're a representational pluralist about modeling, I thought you could model conscious and unconscious contents using propositions and non-propositional, non-propositional way, whatever story you give. And in the conscious case, what's missing is just that conscious awareness or nominal consciousness or something like that, which is what makes the one content conscious, the other one not conscious. So it doesn't seem like a structural difference.
Right, that's okay. So that's the picture I want to reject. Okay. So I want to say there is you can model both the unconscious and the conscious using propositions or non-propositional models. What you're modeling in the case of conscious content is an event in the stream of consciousness. And that is an episode in phenomenal consciousness. And it has very different character to that. In a way I'm going to try and explain later. I mean, so one thing I think is very important is that there's no difference between, in terms of content, there isn't a distinction in consciousness between the vehicle of content and the content itself. The vehicle and the content are both parts of what's given to experience. Conscious content is what's given to consciously. So that's the picture. I don't know if that's clear. Okay. So I want to say something about how this distinction is, what I've been saying so far, is related to Ned Block's famous distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness, which is an important distinction that's been made in the last 20 years in philosophy of mind and psychology, and philosophy of psychology. People have employed this distinction. This is a classic paper by Block called On Confusion about a Function of Consciousness. He elaborated his view about 12 years later. He's been working on it in various places elsewhere. On his website, he has all his papers online. The reason I'm thinking that there must be a connection here is because this is one of my sort of fixed points, is that a conscious thought is not a belief. But what it is bringing what you believe to consciousness. That's what a conscious thought is. So that might sound like, bringing what you believe to consciousness, I said, covers many things. I said it covers the case of judgment, that is either coming to a judgment or acknowledging the truth of something that you already believe. If I say to you, who had the second largest empire in the history of the world, you'll be able to answer Mongolia. Mongolia has the second largest empire in the history of the world. And for those of you who didn't know that before, who were asleep when I said it last week, 2 weeks ago, will have now acquired the belief that Mongolia had the second largest empire in the history of the world. Now, you could, when you judge that, you could either be judging it to be true because you know me to be a good teacher and I'm full of knowledge, fact, truth, and all those things. Or you could just be acknowledging something that you already believe, or bringing to consciousness something you already believe. And that's sometimes classified, I think misleadingly, but this is a bit pedantic, under the heading self-knowledge. When in the recent debate in analytic philosophy of self-knowledge, self-knowledge means knowledge of what you're thinking. It doesn't mean knowledge of yourself. Actually, another way of bringing something to consciousness is through therapy. It's like psychotherapy, regardless of the truth of any particular theory which underpins it, the method of psychotherapy is about bringing things to consciousness and trying to figure out whether those things are things you believe or you want, or are part of your fantasy or part of your reality. It seems like some of these things, anyway, or maybe all of them, are attempts to access your state of mind. Accessing your state of mind seems to be the idea, and that's... So we could ask whether that's the notion that we need in order to understand conscious thought. The notion of accessing the state of mind. This is why I thought it would be important to compare what I'm saying here to Ned Block's distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness. Who's come across this distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness? Many people, most. So let me just explain why I think Ned Block has spent so much time talking about this. It's partly because of the interest in consciousness in psychology and neuroscience. When psychology and neuroscience moved out of its behaviorist phase, one of the things that they started working on was one of the things that they refused to work on. If you remember my talk on behaviorism last term, which was consciousness. And there were various attempts to understand consciousness from a scientific perspective, all of which revolve around the idea that consciousness is what the subject is capable of reporting or accessing in some other way. When the subject can register, when an experimental subject can register that something is happening to them, then they're conscious of it. Some psychologists, some neuroscientists still say that's the only workable sense of consciousness. So there's a book by Stanislav Dehaene. I don't know if anyone has seen this book. It came out last year, called Consciousness in the Brain. Has anyone seen this book? He's a big cheese neuroscientist. I haven't read this book, but I just read a review of it. So I will read the book to see if the review is correct. But there's a very good review by Peter Godfrey Smith in the London Review of Books. Godfrey Smith quotes Dehaene as saying that the only sense that a scientist can give to the notion of consciousness is the notion of something like the notion of conscious report or registration of some event. That's the only sense that is. And he says, and then he says, anything else, any sense of phenomenal consciousness that goes beyond that, takes us towards this mysterious and unacceptable dualism. Now you can see why a scientist might say that if that scientist was committed to some sort of verificationist view about phenomena, say that the only things that are real are the things that science can record or detect. Anything that can't be recorded or detected by science isn't real, or it's some fantasy of the dualist, or religion. That's religion. Yeah, religion's to blame. Yeah, that's what I say. That's a very, very typical way that scientists talk about these things. And I'm not dissing the scientists. This is the way that you actually talk. But people in this university, I've had conversations with them who say similar things. That there's nothing to the idea of the reality of some state of mind unless it can be recorded in some experimental test, or unless there's some way of operationalizing the notion. Operationalizing means testing for it. Now, Block would encounter this view among many scientists, neuroscientists and psychologists, and as you can see from the philosophical point of view, it's very frustrating because there clearly is something more to consciousness than merely the ability to report something, or at least it seems through it. If it seems that there is, then that's enough, because consciousness is, in some sense, seeming. So Bloch says we need a distinction between two kinds of consciousness, and he actually says that the word consciousness is ambiguous. I don't think he needs to say it's ambiguous. He needs to say there are two kinds of consciousness. Or maybe he does, it doesn't really matter. This is how he originally introduced the distinction in his 95 paper. He said that there's phenomenal consciousness is one thing, and access consciousness is the other. Phenomenal consciousness, he says, is experience. The phenomenally conscious aspect of a state is what it's like to be in that state. So that's Nagel's idea of what it's like to be in the state of mind. That's the phenomenally conscious state. No, sorry, it's those states which are where you can say that there's something it's like to be in that state. That's the phenomenal conscious state. He says experience, I mean, it doesn't really matter whether that only covers sense experience or something else. We'll come on to that later. Access consciousness, on the other hand, is something else. It's availability for use in reasoning and rationally guiding speech and action. So, one idea is what's phenomenally given to you, the phenomenal consciousness. It's pretty much what I've been calling consciousness for the whole of these seminars. The other is access consciousness, which is your ability to access things. Does that make broadly sense? That makes sense broadly. Have I misrepresented Bloch in some way? I have some experts on Bloch here. Okay, and what Bloch says is that a lot of the time, and this is simplifying a lot of this discussion, but that a lot of the time when scientists talk about consciousness, they're only talking about access consciousness. And Bloch wants to say phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness can come apart. You can have one without the other. You can have phenomenal consciousness without access. You can have access without phenomenal. Paul, do you want to say something? Or are you just thinking? Something's going through your phenomenal consciousness.
Actually, no, I will say, I was thinking,
we come back to
would that mean that in certain cases, if you come apart, it would be consistent? I'm not talking about this would be a plausible belief, but it would be consistent for somebody to think that it's possible for an entity to have access consciousness when it doesn't even have any phenomenal consciousness, when there's nobody home. For example, let's say you're John Searle, and you were very, very sceptical about the idea that computers have any kind of mental life like us. But obviously, if you're John Searle, you're going to be quite open to the idea that you can have some kind of expert system, a neural network, or something which is which is doing a lot of reasoning and rationally guided speech and action. And you could therefore say this machine, this thing has access consciousness, but it doesn't have anything like what we would call mind. It doesn't even have anything on low consciousness.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Someone, I think, who has that view, that John Searle view, would say, well, this just goes to show that access consciousness isn't a form of consciousness, because a machine could have, if a machine could have it, and we know that
that was kind of a concern. You see a weird way for someone like Searle to talk.
I think, yeah, Searle wouldn't talk like, he wouldn't say that there was access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness. He would say, in fact, he does say this basically. He says, accessing it is one thing, that's got very little to do with consciousness. Consciousness is phenomenal consciousness, and accessing is bringing something to phenomenal consciousness. So there are various kinds of case which Bloch thinks are ways of putting these two ideas apart. I'm not going to go into them here, but the sort of thing, let me just indicate the sort of thing where you think you could have phenomenal consciousness without access consciousness. Well, Bloch cites the example of blind sight patients who are people who've suffered some trauma to the part of their visual cortex, so they declare themselves to be blind in that part of the cortex, but they have a very good ability, supposedly a good ability, to identify the presence of certain stimuli in the part of the visual field in which they declare themselves to be blind. This is taken to be a case of where they can access something without it being phenomenally conscious. Now Bloch is very exercised by the idea that there ought to be tests, experimental tests for phenomenal consciousness without access consciousness. Of course, that's rather difficult to get, given that access consciousness is all about how to report on your mental states. And the way to experiment on subjects and consciousness is by human subjects is getting them to report on things. The way to experiment on other subjects is by sticking things in their brains. or maybe getting them to run around in mazes and things. And there are all sorts of things to do. Yeah, so anyway, there are two notions here. The question I want to ask is, in a way, what's the most fundamental notion here? What's the notion that's relevant to conscious thought as I'm thinking of it? I want to start by just asking, well, what is accessibility? What does it mean to say that something is accessible, or that you're accessing it? On the face of it, I say that access seems to be a dispositional notion. The first credit card in this country, I think, was called an access card. Does anyone remember an access card? I remember that. My dad got an access card, and this was an amazing thing. It was something that gave you access to stuff. You could get stuff with this card, even though you didn't actually pay any money immediately for it. This is an incredibly novel idea. And the basic idea, of course, is not novel. It goes back a long way, the idea of credit. But the idea that you could have this card, which somehow you could use to give you access to stuff. But my dad, who was a very cautious, financially cautious person, never really used his access card. So he had access to stuff, but he didn't use it. So he just had this purely dispositional. His access to stuff was just dispositional. He could have used it. If he could have used it to buy petrol and things like that, but he didn't, because he was a very cautious person. He was brought up in the war under conditions of austerity. There was rationing for 10 years after the war, and so he was very cautious. He still is very cautious with money, my father. So he had access. He had an access card, but he didn't actually access anything with it. Right? But nonetheless, he still had access. So it's a dispositional notion. So as with dispositions, and I've talked about dispositions a bit before, we can distinguish between the disposition and the manifestation of the disposition. So we can distinguish between solubility and dissolving, between fragility and something else, whatever that is. Sometimes people say that fragility must involve breaking or smashing or shattering. Not necessarily. If you imagine you could have a very fragile piece of paper, it doesn't shatter. A piece of paper is fragile without it shattering or breaking. I suppose it could break, but not. Anyway, that's about the meaning of the word fragility. But so dispositional notions and their manifestations are very different things. The disposition and its manifestations are different things. So we can ask about access. What is the manifestation of the ability to access things in consciousness? Now, Bloch wanted to say in a later paper, Bloch decides that he recognized that disposition, access is a dispositional notion, or broad, and then he says, and he replaces the word access later on broadcast, or being available to be broadcast by the brain, I suppose. He says dispositional notions like accessibility, this is what he said later on, this is 2008, are notoriously flexible depending on context. I will require not just potential broadcasting for accessibility, but actual global broadcasting. Global, he means globally across the brain. It doesn't mean globally across the world. Broadcasting within the brain, that's what's happening. So accessibility involves broadcasting information within the brain. Part of the background here, if anyone knows about this, is the idea of a global workspace model of consciousness, if you come across that. I may say something about that in the future. But anyway, then he goes on, then Bloch sort of takes it back a bit. He says, actual global broadcasting does not itself require that any consuming machinery in the brain actually processes the broadcast representation. So it is a notion involving potentiality. I think any idea that says something's access conscious or a-conscious, as he calls it, when it's available for broadcast, or that it can be broadcast, or that it can be consumed by representation processing mechanisms in the brain, does involve some element of dispositionality or potentiality. And I think he tries to back off a bit from this, but in the end he admits that there is some element of dispositionality in this. Now, I want to say that if we suppose that, let's suppose that there is this thing, consciousness, access consciousness, which consists in a representation or a mental state being accessible in whatever way, for the control of action, or the control of speech, or just for broadcast across the brain. Then we have to distinguish the accessibility from the actual accessing. So accessing is something like an event or an occurrence. Again, being accessible is not an event or an occurrence. Being accessible is a condition or a property of something. But I want to say that a mental state can be accessible even if it's not being accessed. If that's true, then I think, in whatever sense accessing is a conscious occurrence, then conscious occurrence of accessing must be different, must be conscious in a different sense from mere accessibility. Or if it's not, and this is what Bloch basically said, this is what he says is the phenomenal sense of consciousness. So I think that if you think that accessibility is what makes for this one kind of consciousness, accessibility is a property of things, issues when you access something, issues in an event or an occurrence. If that event or occurrence is itself meant to be conscious, then that won't be conscious in the same sense, and that's the phenomenal sense of consciousness. So let's suppose. If there isn't another sense, maybe there's another sense, but let's suppose it's that. So what this suggests to me is that a simpler way of looking at the whole thing. I think that philosophy is the art of making complex things simple and simple things complex. You make simple things complex, and then you make complex things simple. Let's take this very complex setup to say, a simpler picture would be this. The mental state is access conscious in Bloch's sense when it can manifest itself in phenomenal consciousness, or when something about it, the state, can manifest itself in phenomenal consciousness. When that is to say, when it can manifest itself in an occurrence or an event which is phenomenally conscious. That's what I mean. Because if the accessibility of this mental state is just a matter of its being passed from one part of the brain to another but never reaching any phenomenal consciousness, then the subject will never be able to report it. To be able to report it, it must enter their phenomenal consciousness. So otherwise it would just be unconscious processing. So this is why I want to say that access consciousness presupposes phenomenal consciousness, because you can't be access conscious unless a representation can't be access conscious unless it's disposed to result in an episode of phenomenal consciousness. And that's why we want to call it consciousness at all, because that's when the subject can register it, when it's in their consciousness. So this is why I jump to conclusion and I say there aren't really two kinds of consciousness at all. Now, you look like you're really, really itching to refute what I've just said, so Alex first.
I just wonder if that's right for blind sight patients. It seems like there's some piece of information that they're accessing. But I think sort of built into the case in these actual cases that there's nothing it's like for them to see the circle or the X or whatever's on board.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's hard to see how to understand their ability if it's not in terms of something akin to access.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, can I hold that point for a second? Great.
Yeah, I mean, I have a quick follow-up to that. Why is that funny? And another question. The follow-up is that you're linking between report and phenomenal consciousness. You might be put under pressure by the idea that blindsided patients do report.
Yeah, you're right. That was too quick. Yeah.
Maybe that's part of the timing. The other question was your picture here, access consciousness presupposed to phenomenal consciousness. Does that rely on a specific notion of phenomenal consciousness? For instance, if you have Bloch's notion of phenomenal consciousness, whatever how that is, would this go through? Or is this special once we have your understanding of phenomenal consciousness, where we do away with qualia, etc.?
Oh, I see. Yes, I think it doesn't presuppose that Bloch notion. And I think Bloch thinks actually that thoughts can be phenomenally conscious. And I don't think he thinks they're a thought qualia. So I think he now believes that phenomenal consciousness includes more than just thought. Sorry, more than just qualia. Yeah, I think what I want to say, what Alex said, I have to clarify what I said about this, but yeah, sorry, Henry, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so Bloch doesn't think that blindside cases are access conscious because he builds other criteria into what access consciousness is. So he doesn't think it's just information that's available for reporting. He thinks it's information that's rationally available for reporting, like, so the information would give you justification for believing something, something like that.
Right.
And he doesn't think that blindside people fulfill that criterion. So it's just blindside's a complete red herring in this debate. It's neither access nor phenomenal. He as Bloch thinks it's neither. So you don't get that.
Yeah, but I think, thank you for that. No, that's absolutely right. Yeah. I was speaking very loosely. Can I just say something about this? I think what I want to say is that understand what it is in general for there to be such a thing as access consciousness. You have to be talking about the ability of a conscious subject to report or act on or express in some way states of mind that they can access. I think the best description of that reporting, for creatures like us, the basic nature of that reporting involves bringing about certain occurrences in phenomenal consciousness. And if it was possible for there to be bringing about of things which didn't involve any occurrences in phenomenal consciousness, where people would just, this may actually just be answered by what Henry just said, but I'm not sure. But where people could just sort of, so to speak, act on things without having any awareness of what they were doing. There'd be sort of robotic accessing of information. Then I think there'll be something different. That wouldn't be the sort of consciousness that we had. If access consciousness is going to be a form of consciousness, it has to be about bringing things to consciousness, about bringing things to phenomenal consciousness. I don't know. That's my very simple line of thought. You had another point?
I was just thinking on Henry's point that might be fair enough. That's the way Bloch uses the term. That's the way these experimental results can be run. But it looks like you start to very quickly see the makings of the right kind of thought experiment. Someone who's very much like a blindsight patient, but who does go through some inferences and do it, but none of it's phenomenally conscious. Nevertheless, they do have some phenomenal consciousness, but they're not accessing this bit. You can sort of see how to build the case up, I think, even if the actual blindsighted patients don't fall under Bloch's terminology. But also, I mean, what do you think about a case where someone who's a blindsight patient is navigating around things? but isn't. They're not offering any verbal reports, but their behavior is such that it's very difficult to explain their navigation without something like, again, I'd be inclined to call it access, but maybe that's to help myself to a term of art.
So what I'm saying is, if there was a creature who, yeah, absolutely. So suppose there's a creature that got around in the environment by accessing information in its stored database or memory bank or whatever it was, there's no reason to say that creature was conscious. Insofar as this is going to be access consciousness is supposed to be some form of consciousness, then it has to relate to phenomenal consciousness. That's what I'm in. It has to be something that, sorry, it has to be something that's in, it's a property or state of a creature who's capable of bringing things to consciousness, to phenomenal consciousness. So I think a totally, a purely accessing entity that could, even one that could get around the environment, like a Sony robot or a vacuum cleaner robot or some very sophisticated robot, isn't conscious purely in virtue of accessing information. That's what I say. Yeah, Martin.
So as a sufficient condition on access consciousness, do you use to capture things like fears and maybe desires as well?
Yeah.
So you might think that a fear manifests itself in phenomenal consciousness as some kind of trembling of your hand or something like that. You might not understand why your hand is trembling, which you then still say, but still the fear is access conscious right now because it manifests itself in phenomenal consciousness. Because you can feel the trembling with your hand. So I was thinking
so
sort of
doesn't-
access
yeah.
has this
So it doesn't have,
cognitive ring to it.
I mean, it doesn't have to be intelligible what's, yeah.
Yeah. Whereas I think at least there's a lot that discusses it.
Yeah.
It does need to be something like intelligible.
Right. But the rational, he talks about the rational control of speech and actions. Yeah. So I think what I want to say is that, following on from that example, that there's a general picture here, which I want to fit into my picture, which is that you're unconscious, and there's the way your unconscious manifests itself in phenomenal consciousness. And insofar as what Bloch is talking about is real, I want to say that can fit into that picture. But I think the picture is broader, maybe vaguer than Bloch's, maybe less experimentally tractable. But take your example of fear, it's a good example. I mean, I think fear is, for those kinds of fears which are persisting states or conditions, like a fear of dogs someone may have, maybe it's an irrational fear of dogs, but it's something that affects their behavior. They may not even be fully aware that they're frightened of a dog. They get the sensation of trembling, or the fear could manifest itself in all sorts of ways, various terms of conscious events. That's an instance of a kind of thing, which I think is the kind of thing that a lot of Bloch's examples are, which is the relationship between phenomenal consciousness and the unconscious. What I'm objecting to is saying that access consciousness is a kind of form of consciousness. I think this is like what's going on when people talk about access. It means you can access it, you can bring it to consciousness. That's what it means. And there's just one notion of consciousness, which is the phenomenal consciousness. That's where I want to get to. I haven't expressed it properly. Alex.
I think you've already answered the question. I thought earlier you were wanting to distinguish your position from the John Searle position that came up to the effect that access consciousness isn't properly classified as a form of consciousness.
Yeah.
I thought that in response to the objections or questions that have just been raised, that's where you ended up with.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's what I want to say. Yeah. But there is mentality. So I distinguish myself from Searle by saying there is unconscious intentionality, but I think that access consciousness isn't a form of consciousness. And it's not just a verbal point, because it's a question of whether you think that you think of tests, actual clinical or tests for consciousness, whether it's subject is consciousness, are tests about what they can either report or what they can otherwise indicate. What they're reporting is the occurrence of some phenomenon within them. And it's intelligible to suppose there could be such that could be that phenomenon, even if they weren't able to report it.
Sorry, just to be clear, you said access consciousness isn't a form of consciousness. Do you mean isn't a distinctive form of consciousness?
Yeah, that's right.
It's
Isn't a distinctive form of consciousness. Or you can say a representation of access conscious, which means, insofar as it's conscious, it just means you can bring it to consciousness. That's, yeah.
I think I already know the answer to this, but is this meant to be about content, right? Something about accessing the content. It's not some, so would this count if I were to bring to consciousness the fact that I had a belief I hadn't been paying attention to for a very long time, but I didn't recognize its content?
What's an example?
I'm thinking of just having some sort of conscious episode having to do with my having a certain kind of other state, independent of its content, as opposed to taking, say, the content of some belief and making that content conscious, appreciating what it is that I believe, as opposed to merely appreciating that I have some belief.
You have some belief or other.
Yeah, maybe I come
It would
to.
have to be, yeah, you'd have to be bringing to mind, yeah, the belief with the content that it has.
Yeah, okay.
You could say something about content. Okay, that brings me to the end of the second part. Before I just sum up what I've just said, I want to commercial break. We have tomorrow, as part of our project, there is a one-day symposium workshop on immateriality, the idea of the immaterial. That's in Trinity College tomorrow. And it's a very interesting subject. And it's partly historical investigation with things from medieval philosophy, from modern period. Chris from our project is going to speak. Paul Lodge from Oxford will be speaking. Maria Rosa Antoniazza from King's College will be speaking about Leibniz. Howard Robinson will be talking about his version of dualism or idealism. And that's it. That's tomorrow. I should have mentioned this right at the beginning. It's called Immateriality. There's some handouts over there. And you can come, it's free. But I think you have to register properly. Okay. End of commercial break. So I hope it's clear what I'm saying about access consciousness. I haven't quite formulated it properly. I want to say that Bloch is describing something real. It's not a distinctive form of consciousness. Insofar as there's any consciousness involved, it's the consciousness that's involved in creating a certain kind of occurrence in the stream of consciousness. Yes, would you like to?
I'm just wondering, would you then say that all consciousness is inarticulate?
It's inarticulatable.
Not inarticulatable, but
Inarticulate.
not yet articulated.
Yeah, I want to deny that. Yeah. So that's very much Bloch's line of thought. I think Bloch thinks that there's something inexpressible about part of the problem that he has in these very complex cases that he designs to try and experimentally test for the presence of phenomenal consciousness independently of access. So that any attempts to express what's conscious is classified as access. Now, I want to say phenomenal consciousness is the stream of consciousness, and I can express what is in my consciousness.
Yeah, that expressing is a kind of articulation.
Yeah, so phenomenal consciousness can be articulated.
But I'm just saying that there's not a difference. But it's almost like you're saying consciousness and unconsciousness are the same.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying the opposite of that. I'm saying that they're different. I'm saying they're not the same, they're different. Yeah. So I say that, I think the next part of my presentation will, I hope, make that a bit clearer. Because I do think actually that the...
Or is it degrees of articulation?
Well, there is something like that. But it's not a matter of degree. I think the difference between the conscious and the unconscious. So let me say, here's the next section is called the reality of conscious thinking. So I want to say conscious thinking isn't just a matter of being able to access something that's unconscious. It's natural occurrence with its own nature. So that's the phrase I use for this. So here I'm talking about conscious thinking, not perceiving, not sensing. So just focusing on the case of thinking to contrast with belief. And I call it making explicit some aspect of your worldview. That's the label. I don't regard that as an explanation or anything, but this is what happens when you think something consciously is that you have there's something in your unconscious, your worldview, and you make this thing explicit in an occurrence and phenomenal consciousness. Coming back to what Alex in the front just asked, I need to just clarify my terminology when it comes to the notion of content. So there's a problem in the last seminar, I realized that. So this is the terminology I'm using, but I say the intentional mental states. Intentional mental states are those that represent the world, or aspects of the world. So I don't think, for example, that I don't want to say intentional mental states are those that represent the world to be a certain way, because they may not represent the world to be a certain way. They may just represent some aspect of the world. So I think, fear of dogs, for example, is not a representation of the world as being a certain way. It's an emotional attitude towards dogs. Those are aspects or things in the world. So I say this representation here. Some people think that's controversial to think of intentionality in terms of representation, and that's where I'm starting from at the moment. We'll say more about that maybe next year, if you're still around next year. So intentional mental states represent aspects of the world. The types of intentional state, like the difference between a desire or a belief or something, are what I call modes. By modes, I mean mode this is just a term, I borrowed it from John Searle. A mode is just something like belief. So belief is a mode of intentionality, desire is a mode of intentionality, fear is a mode of intentionality, perception is a mode of intentionality, so is sensation. These are all modes. Now, it's very important that which modes there are is not a straightforward question, and it's a question that has a complex answer. Whether every real psychological mode is one that corresponds to the ways we have for talking about the psychological, that's not necessarily something I'm assuming. So, is there a difference between desiring something and wanting something? I want to say no, that's not. The way that we use the word desire in philosophy, or at least in analytic philosophy, desire does not have any of the connotations that it has in ordinary language. It just means wanting something. So there are other forms of desire which are different and have different characteristics. But when I talk about desire, I'm talking about just wanting. So there is a question of which modes there actually are. I'm not going to address that at the moment. But that would be, in the case of the unconscious, the question of the structure of the psychological capacity. So if memory is a mode, then remembering, could have two psychological elements. Some people, psychologists, think that there's a distinction between remembering an occurrence or an episode, episodic memory, and there's remembering facts, which for some inexplicable reason people call semantic memory. It's called semantic memory. When people talk about semantic memory, they mean remembering facts, remembering that such and such. So if you remember that Mongolia had the second largest empire in the history of the world, that's what psychologists call semantic memory. And they really should apologize for that terminology, because it's nothing to do with, you could remember semantic things, that is facts about meaning, but in fact, it's just facts in general. So don't get misled when you see people talk about semantic memory. It just means remembering facts. Remembering episodes is something else. That's remembering a particular occurrence and actually remembering that you were involved in some particular occurrence. So it's called episodic memory. So those are two modes corresponding to the word memory. They're different psychological modes. They have something in common. Memory is something real. It's something in your mind. It has intentional content. It represents things. So that's what I mean by a mode. I mean something like memory or belief or science. The other piece of terminology I'm going to use is the notion of an object. Object of a mental state is what the state represents. So there's the, and I'm speaking quite loosely here, but by what the state represents, I mean normally it's what the state represents in the world. So the object of a desire is the thing you want. I say the object of a belief is not what you believe, but it's what your belief is about in the world. The object of your fear is what you fear, and so on. So that's what I use the word object, and I'm not going to talk about this here, but I think that since you can have beliefs about things that don't exist, then not all objects of your thought need exist. But I won't talk about that here. The content of a mental state is the way that the mental state represents, given it a given mode. So if you want to know what I mean by content, and I mean, just bear in mind the great example of Hesperus and Phosphorus. So there you've got the planet Venus, it's the morning star, it's the evening star, it's Hesperus, it's Phosphorus. Which one is the evening star? Who remembers? It's important. What is it? Hesperus. Hesperus is the evening star. Phosphorus, the morning star. It's the same thing, it's the planet Venus. There's one thing, there's one object, different contents, different ways in which the object is represented. So by content, the way I use the word content, and this is a piece of philosophical terminology, so I can use it the way I like, but it actually corresponds, it encompasses everything that other people call content and more. Some people only use the word content to describe the propositional content of a belief. I say the propositional content of a belief is the way something is represented, certainly. Yeah. But I also say that the content of a fear, when the fear is directed on a dog, is also content. So you can have propositional and non-propositional content, on my view. Content expresses the fact that things are represented in different, the same thing can be represented in different ways, under different aspects, as John Searle called it. That's why he used the phrase aspectual shape. And I follow a lot of what he says in that. That's it. So if you want to find out about this way of thinking about intentionality generally, chapter 4, this brilliant book called The Objects of Thought. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant book. Really recommend it. That's all these notions are clearly, exquisitely, beautifully explained in this chapter 4 of this book. Now, so this is why I just want to clarify actually what I said at the end of last week on that question. The unconscious content is the content of the subject's worldview. So that's the way the subject's worldview represents the world in all its complexity. So I can say that the unconscious content is modeled by the propositional content, but that doesn't mean the unconscious content is somehow that there have to be propositions in your unconscious. Maybe there are, maybe there aren't, but that's not the right way of thinking of it. The way of thinking of it is that that your worldview, your unconscious worldview, represents the world in all sorts of ways. And its content is whatever ways in which the world is represented unconsciously. And so then the question is, which comes back to your question, what is the conscious content? Now, I think the model picture, that is a kind of content, because you're using this object to pick out a way the world is represented. So can you model the content of a conscious thought too? In a similar way, by using a proposition. Well, I think clearly you can, because you can say that someone is thinking something. When you say someone is thinking that something is the case, then you're using a proposition to, this is the wrong When you say that someone is thinking something consciously, they might be thinking some proposition. So you're using a proposition to pick out what they're thinking. So if you say that you're currently thinking that Mongolia is the second largest, had the second largest empire in the history of the world, I could say that, you know, that you're thinking that, and I pick it out by using that proposition. There's another thing going on, though, in the case of when you're consciously thinking that. 2 people or 3 people in this room could be thinking that. Bernard could be thinking it in German, for example. He could be going through his mind in German. Probably isn't, but it could be. Alfredo could be thinking about it in Italian. Could be thinking about it in other different languages. The conscious character of that thought can be linked to the same proposition, namely the proposition I express when I say Mongolia had the second largest empire in the history of the world, even if the words going through your mind are different. Now the conclusion, and that's just a truism, that's just a fact, that people can be thinking different things, can be thinking sentences in different languages that have the same propositional content. Well, what I want to say is that the way you're thinking it in that language is part of how you're representing the world to be. So it's part of the content in this broad sense that I use the word content. Part of the way you're representing the world to be in that conscious episode. And so the conclusion I want to draw from that is that where conscious episodes are concerned, modeling isn't the whole truth about the representational content. So modeling is not, as far as the conscious episode is concerned, modeling is not the whole truth. It's not the only thing that we can say about what the representational content of this state is. The contrast I want to have with the unconscious is basically you've got this functional organization in your mind or your brain, and that's modeled by using different propositions, and that's all there is to the content of the way that the world is represented. There's just those 2 things. There's the functional organization, and there's the a whole bunch of dispositions, let's say. A whole bunch of dispositions, unconscious dispositions, and you model those by using propositions. In the case of consciousness, you have a whole bunch of things going on. It's not dispositional. You have a whole bunch of occurrences. You've got the stream of consciousness. That's modeled by, it can be modeled by propositions, like the proposition that Mongolia had the second largest empire, blah, blah, blah. But there's also something else going on in the case of consciousness. That is that's what's different. That's the phenomenal content of what you're thinking. This is what I say. This is why this bit is in bold. It's because it's very important and very true. The modeling is not the whole truth about the representational content. It's about how they represent the world. Yeah, Paul.
Okay, with all that extra stuff going on, which isn't covered by the model.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that you happen to take a representational view, so all that extra stuff you're going to say is representational as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in that case, then, wouldn't it be the case that all of that extra stuff, even if it's not captured by, say, some simple model I come up with,
yeah,
is still is somehow relates to, it could be captured by claims that the part of the world or parts of the world is a certain way. But any bit of that stuff presumably would be saying something about, well, this part of the world or all of the world or whatever it is thus. And wouldn't that suggest that if I had a full description of the world or some possible world, and it happened to be the one which I'm consciously thinking about, then that would be a model, but that would seem to have to capture everything and representation that's in my head.
So I want to deny that, because think of the example of 2 people thinking something in different languages. So I'm not saying you have to think in a language, but sometimes people do try and express their thought in language. Mm-hmm. If 2 people could think of the same thoughts in different languages, then that difference won't be captured in terms of how it represents the world.
Okay, so
In
that's,
the possible world sense. But it's captured in the sense of what some people would call the vehicle of consciousness, of content, which are the words that you're thinking in.
wouldn't you suggest that that thing that you experience, that aspect of it is non-representational then, if you put it in either of its, that's part of the world?
Well, I want to say it's part of how your mental episode represents the world, and in that sense it is representation. That may just be a terminological thing about representation.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's one other aspect of intentional mental states, not only this representative, there is some creative model, because our world is not only external world, it's sometimes the world of culture, which creates, and we have to judge our creation. This all belongs to these, I would say, conscious states of our ability or our intentionality.
I think that's true. I mean, I think I should say that I'm just restricting myself to trying to pick out one phenomenon, which is the phenomenon of what I'm calling consciously thinking something. Of course, under the broad heading of thinking, all sorts of other things come in too. And I'm just not talking about those at the moment. I'm just focusing on this one thing.
Because we are not only ancient representantia, we are more than that.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Would it be, I'm trying to sort of understand this, would this be then sort of like the tip of the iceberg?
Yeah, exactly.
It's down, it's there.
Conscious. So the iceberg is the unconscious.
Oh,
The tip of the iceberg is what's in consciousness. It's above, and its phenomenal difference consists in the fact that it's above water.
it's above water, yeah.
I'm not quite sure how the analogy goes.
But isn't then in a way,
The analogy's not quite right because, of course, it's all the iceberg is all the same
it's all the
homogeneous
same.
character.
So this
That's the thing.
sameness
It's
is a
not.
little,
So it's only an analogy. That's the
it's an
thing.
analogy, but the sameness is a little problematic for me.
Yeah. No. I mean, you're right. Okay, forget the iceberg.
Can you say icing on the cake instead? Because that's a different,
Yeah,
different
it's sort of
sort.
all there, yeah.
Yeah, it's a different thing. It has a different phenomenal vividness.
Can we actually even think the same things?
Yes. So, but I think that's not as important as the sense in which we think other things. So I think one thing, in the sense in which we think very different things. So I'm interested in individual differences. In explaining what I'm going to call phenomenal content, I'm thinking of individual experiences, which are all often very different. Experiences all our experiences of this room now are very different, a very different character. They differ in their phenomenology, they differ in their phenomenal content, and I want to say that's part of how they represent the world. That may be obvious, that may seem like it's obvious, but I suppose I'm arguing, one always argues in a particular historical context, so I'm arguing against the traditional analytic philosophy that's placed great emphasis on the shareability of thought, and the fact that two people can judge the same thing, and that people can have the same attitude to the same proposition, and that so...
I'm thinking more of the iceberg. So the part that's not.
The iceberg's no, the iceberg
Is it the
metaphor's
same?
going.
We got rid of the iceberg.
Yeah, we've got to go,
Okay.
the iceberg's got to go. Yeah.
Is it the same? The same phenomenal content? Not that we agree on it or anything, that would be too far.
I mean, in principle, two people could have the same phenomenal experience, yes. In practice, people are very different. I believe people have very different experiences of things. And those subjective differences are important to what I'm calling phenomenal content. So, actually, for those who know Frege, who knows Frege's papers, the thought, a logical inquiry. So if you know that paper, he distinguishes three things there. He distinguishes the reference of the word, its sense or mode of presentation, and what he calls the idea, Vorstellung in German, which is the idea, which is also the word for translated as representation. Now, what I'm interested in is that third thing, the idea. The idea has been completely left out of philosophy of mind, because philosophy of mind has approached these questions from the point of view of communication and semantics and truth. Whereas when we approach things from the point of view of consciousness, things look a bit different. So that's my vision of things. My vision of things is to elaborate on what Frege called the idea. Those bits that in semantics you think are irrelevant, because semantics is about the determination of truth value of sentences. But from the point of view of consciousness, they're not irrelevant. And you only get an impoverished view of consciousness when you focus on what Frege called thought, which is the proposition. As I think Frege himself would have admitted, since he wasn't interested in consciousness, but he thought it existed. Does that make the vision any clearer? The vision, I call it the vision, maybe it's the fantasy, the iceberg. So this is the distinction I want to make. It's between, that leads me into what I want to really say about the notion of content. The distinction I want to make between what I call semantic content, which in this case, propositions can model aspects of conscious or unconscious psychological reality, and the phenomenal content, how things are actually represented to the subject in a conscious episode. So phenomenal content goes with ideas in Frege's sense. Semantic content goes with the proposition, that is the thought in Frege's sense. So I just mentioned Frege because that's the way that a lot of talk about content, representational content, representation in general, has progressed in analytic philosophy. And I think that if we focus only on the notion of proposition or the thought, then we won't get any adequate understanding of the intentionality of consciousness. Because that's not what those notions were designed for anyway. So the notion of proposition was designed to play the role of being the ultimate bearers of truth and falsehood. The things that function as the relator of logical connectives. That's what the proposition was. The view that you should understand those things in psychological terms, that you should understand logic in psychological terms, was in the 19th century was called psychologism. So understanding logic and mathematics in psychological terms was psychologism. So the way to avoid psychologism about logic is to think in terms of the proposition. Don't think in terms of psychological acts of judgment, but think in terms of the proposition that those are the ultimate bearers of truth and falsehood. They're the things that are related in the relator of propositional logical connectives and so on. Now that's all fine if you're talking about logic. Psychologism is a mistake when it comes to logic. Logic is normative. It's a normative science. It's not a psychological science. But when you're talking about the psychological, psychologism must be the right view. So this is why I call my view psychologism about the psychological. And if you're really psychologistic about the psychological, then you have to don't start with the notion of the proposition. The notion of the proposition is a logical notion. It's something that's made for logic. Start with the subject's point of view. Start with the world as given to the subject in experience. And that's why my view, I wish Chris Moore was here, because he thinks that there's nothing new in this seminar at all. I'm just going over boring old ground. But that's why I think my view is a bit new, because it's psychologism about the psychological. So if you see Chris, you can tell him that I actually said something new. Now what you will hear from people is that intentionality must be understood in terms of the proposition, not in terms of the point of view of consciousness, because it's only that way that we can get ourselves out of our own heads. And if it was just, if we were looking at Frege's ideas, then we'd all be stuck inside a private sphere and communicating. This is very, very vague and woolly what I'm saying now, so I've almost finished. So this is the sort of the vague and woolly bit at the end. Communication is one thing, thinking is another. There's what you're thinking, what's in your consciousness right now, the world as it's given to you in imagination, thought, memory, perception, and so on. And then there's the bit of that you manage to communicate to someone. what I want to say is you won't get a proper understanding of the intentionality of consciousness unless you drop the idea that what we're trying to do is to use the same resources for understanding consciousness as we use to understand communication and truth and logic. In other words, the semantic notions. Forget communication. Semantic notions are all about how truth values are determined. That's what semantics is. So the way I understand things, intentionality is broader than semantics. Intentionality is about the mind. Semantics is about the determination of truth value. Any questions about that? Yes.
Yes, okay, just for clarity. You said earlier that propositions are a way of modeling.
Yeah.
They're sort of just a means of modeling, like sticks and balls for modeling DNA.
Yeah.
Is this collection of modes like beliefs and desires, which sounds to me like you're talking about something like a salient recurring phenomenon?
Yeah.
We correct.
Yeah.
Is a different way of modeling? It sounds to me like a substantially different way of modeling.
Yeah, yeah. This is it's a really good question. I think maybe what your question is asking is how does your model hook up with reality? Because what I'm saying is
yes.
What I'm saying is there's a psychological reality. Yeah. Psychological reality does consist. Let's take the case of memory.
Yeah.
I think memory is part of psychological reality. If anything is, memory is part of psychological reality. In a way, your question is, well, isn't this talk we have about memory, isn't that just another model? Isn't that just another model, say, of maybe of the brain or one model of the organism? And how do we know that it's getting at something more?
Well, I kind of don't really care whether it's getting at anything like a fact out in the world.
Right.
In the way you say a proposition is either true or false, and it either relates to a fact in the world. It's not. I'm not interested in whether or not it relates to the world. Just is it a different way of modeling whatever's going on in there? It sounds to me substantially different.
I want to say it is, but I can see that there's a skeptic. Yes, the answer is yes, but
yes.
There's a skeptical. I could see a skeptical line of being pushed that that I can't really make that distinction, and that. But I want to make that distinction. So I want to say that categories like memory pick out some of the psychological natural kinds was the word I used a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
The proposition, I think, is a piece of language that we use to model bits of things within those psychological natural kinds. Thanks. Yeah.
I have an example. In the spirit of asking a question for a small one, useful. In this view, in what way does this view differ from the claim that there are just ineffable elements to intentional states to experience? So I mean, to say that it can't be modeled in terms of proposition seems to me to say that there are bits about it that we can't make statements. That's what it is to model something. Proposition to statements.
So I do think the conscious can be modelled in terms of propositions, but
No,
there's also something else. And what the rest of it is how it's the subject's representation of the world.
But that we can't talk about.
Well, we can, yeah. I mean, because you can express your you can express your representation of the world. Right? I mean, you're describing it, or you can express it, or it may be that someone couldn't understand what you say. They haven't had a representation of the world like that. So when, for example, at the end of last term, Alex tasted Marmite for the first time. You tasted Marmite too. And it was terrible, wasn't it? You thought it was terrible, but he now likes it. So Alex was able to express, he said, this is horrible. Now he may not, and he said other things. He said, I expected it would taste like beef. Now, if you've never tasted Marmite before, and if you've never tasted beef, you wouldn't really be able to understand what he's saying, of course. I don't regard that as a problem. I don't think everything that you express should be understandable by someone who hasn't had certain kinds of experience. So Whether there are ineffable features or indescribable features of experience is another. Whether there are any ineffable or indescribable, I don't know. I mean, I see no reason to think that there aren't, because I'm very relaxed. I'm intensely relaxed, as Tony Blair once said. No, was it Mandelson said, I'm intensely relaxed about people making millions of pounds. I'm very relaxed about there being such ineffable aspects.
I was just thinking, to the extent that you can describe something, you can model it.
Yeah.
Describe something exactly as you're putting forward.
I want to distinguish two things. Describing it by expressing a proposition. So I can say, Alex is frightened of eating Marmite. So that's a proposition, yeah. So, sorry, I see where you're going. Sorry. I say that's a proposition, Alex is frightened of eating Marmite. Alex's fear isn't something that's modeled by best modeled by a proposition, but it's best modeled by a type of event, namely the event of eating Marmite. So that's different. Alex.
Yeah. When you said that conscious thinking, with conscious thinking, you don't get the whole truth by modeling it in terms of propositions.
Yeah.
So there's this extra thing.
Yeah.
You use the example of representational vehicles.
Yes.
But representational vehicles figure in models of thinking at both the conscious and unconscious level. So there's all this stuff about whether animals navigate using cognitive maps, or
right.
whether they have
yes.
some more linguistic storage of information.
Yeah.
Thought being that that's probably an unconscious level.
Yeah.
Rather than much how to learn to them. So I was wondering whether you meant something different by this extra thing that's not captured by the model, and B, whether the extra thing is unmodelable.
I didn't really mean something different. I think the term vehicle, representational vehicle, is used in many, many ways. So I didn't really mean something different by that. But what I haven't said is what makes the difference between a representational vehicle that's conscious and one that isn't. Yeah, that's the thing I haven't said. This comes back to Randy's question. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go there. I've just realised I'm meeting someone at 6 o'clock at King's College. So I actually have to leave at this point on that difficult question, which I will have to ponder and return to next week. So, okay, thank you. Thanks very much. I'll be in touch. Oh, see you tomorrow. Who's coming tomorrow? See you tomorrow.